We got 3 people. Everyone say hi.
Hi. Hi.
Perfect. So, Titanic II, that's what our presentation is going to be of. In 2012, Clive Palmer, an Australian billionaire, decided that he wanted to replicate the Titanic and make a second one. However, that project was pushed back and it's now canceled due to financial issues. But there were still a lot of concerns that got risen up when the Titanic 2 idea was out there. And a lot of people are superstitious that the Titanic 2 would follow its predecessor Under the Sea, but that's not necessarily the case if we look at the new Titanic and compare it to the old one. So let's look at some facts that will sink the idea of Titanic 2 going under the ocean. So what does Titanic 2 have to offer? Well, first off, it'll have a whole extra deck for lifeboats. And it'll have new technology, new radar and sonar devices, so it can see what's out there, see what's on the sea, have better communication with other ships, so and so. The Titanic 2, I don't think any ship can be called unsinkable. Realistically, any ship can sink, but Titanic 2 is built with all these safety features in place. And all the icebergs are gone anyway, according to this article called Glacier Blamed for the Berg That Sank Titanic Unleashes More Ice by the Morning Edition in 2014. They talked about how it was glaciers that sent icebergs out into the sea, but now that the ocean levels are rising and global warming is occurring, those icebergs they're long gone, and there's really no threat out there in the ocean for any ships today. And again, with the technology that modern ships have, it's kind of difficult to miss an iceberg. And there have been different routes planned for the new Titanic, according to Zurich K on an article titled Tycoon Plans a Titanic II in 2018. They talked about the whole story of the Titanic II, and they talked about how they were planning a different route for the Titanic II to take. So, if anything, as a lower chance of repeating history exactly if they were to go back through with it. Now, Titanic 2 has all these features in place, all these new advanced things to make sure it won't repeat history. But the sinking of the original Titanic was more than just the technology and everything. It was more than just hitting an iceberg. There was a lot that happened on that ship that sealed its doom. First off, there were 7 ignored warnings by the crew. They maintained a full 23 knots in the ocean. This was brought to my attention by an article by Funk and Wagnalls, excerpt titled Titanic Disaster, they wrote in 2018, where the ship just maintained this full speed, even with 7 iceberg warnings. They just had the ship go through full speed, 23 knots. On top of that, the communication in the Marconi room was completely shut off, and they would have difficulty contacting other ships near the area. The Titanic had 16 watertight compartments, and one fatal flaw. Even though they were designed to prevent the ship from sinking, the watertight doors themselves were too slow, and too many watertight doors were compromised, and that's what sealed the ship's fate after striking the iceberg. And one of the biggest reasons were there weren't enough lifeboats on board. That's like common knowledge, but I figured this out. I figured out a different story on an article by Berg titled "The Real Reason for the Titanic Tragedy" in 2012. They talked about Thomas Andrews, the designer of the ship, and how they recognized that they didn't have enough lifeboats for all the people on board. They went. There was speculation that they went for an aesthetic choice of the number of lifeboats. There are a lot of factors too. Like the Titanic was new; it was a really big ship. The regulations were not up to date, so they didn't really applied old regulations to a new ship. So that's kind of what sealed the number of lifeboats that they were stuck with. And then the sinking wasn't treated very seriously until it began to list, until the Titanic began to actually noticeably sink. It wasn't really, a lot of people were just confused. They didn't know what's going on, and action wasn't taken early enough for the whole sinking and to get people off board. So that's one controversy with the Titanic 2. People think it's going to sink like the original, but now there you have it. It doesn't really have to. It's all based on superstition. There's a lot of historical events that went into the first Titanic sinking. The new Titanic has a lot of safety measures in place to make sure it's not the same thing's not going to happen. So why are we even making a second Titanic? Is it wrong to rebuild the Titanic? Well, Titanic 2 is a faithful replica, and it was supposed to be built to not skip a detail, be the exact same as the original ship. It was going to include a memorial museum in one of the smokestacks, and it was just made in the thought of finishing what was started. The Titanic only had one maiden voyage. It was built to be this glorious ship of dreams, and it sunk on its first voyage, and it was this whole thing, and it was lost on day one. And I can't blame someone for wanting to resail such a ship back out into the world. As stated by the article Zrick K, sequel with a happier ending in 2018, this quote about Clive Palmer. He shares Blue Star Line's passion for recreating the ship of dreams as a symbol of love and peace in the world. So it's really just to celebrate an achievement made by people in 1912 that unfortunately got lost to a lot of mistakes. So that's why if we did go back on the idea, even if currently the project has been canceled and there are no plans to build a Titanic 2, if we really did go back to wanting to build a Titanic 2, it's not, it doesn't have to sink. It's possible for it to sink, but the chances are super, super low considering the circumstances. And that's where I'll leave you today.